Hey, what's going on, everyone? How you guys doing today? My name is Matt Jarbo. This is Three Buck Theater, and I wanted to do a quick video kind of going over the politics that were shown in the pilot episode of HBO's Watchmen. What was shown last night was, I would say, generally favorably received amongst audiences, but it has brought out a lot of very interesting commentary from people that I can only describe as being just right wing reactionary nonsense, quite frankly. There's a lot of stuff that I've seen since last night that has just been outright racist, and it's fascinating to me who is being triggered by this show. And then I also have to ask the question, is that exactly what Damon Lindelof wanted to do by setting Watchmen in this world with this politics, at least the politics that we got to see coming out of the whole thing, right? So I wanted just to kind of go through a brief overview of what went down and why I think it's fascinating. So and there's spoilers, by the way, so you should just be aware of that. So first things first, you have the Tulsa Riots of 1921, where there were 100 to 300 African Americans killed when racists started attacking Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I didn't know that this was a real life event. In fact, I would argue that a lot of people didn't know that this was in fact a real life event that took place, and it's a definite black spot on our nation's history, and one that is now being talked about pretty heavily today. And I find that to be quite invigorating. You know, looking back at the mistakes of our past is how we don't repeat them. And that's kind of interesting that Damon Lindelof would start on that particular storyline. Now, the storyline kind of drops dead after that because it goes 98 years into the future. So we're still trying to figure out exactly where it's going to play out. However, I do feel that it is going to tie in to the resurgence of the 7th Calvary. Now, the 7th Calvary are the white supremacist group that is featured in the trailers. They are the ones wearing the Rorschach mask. And those guys are actually, again, based off of real life individuals. Like, for example, General Custer, part of the 7th Calvary. It's one of the reasons why Little Bighorn was the code name that was then text to Sister Night, letting her know that they had come back. And in the show, they had been gone for 3 years. They just went underground, they were gone, and now for some reason, they decided to return, and we don't really know why just yet, but we're going to be figuring that out. A lot of people who were trying to call it and say that this is a racist show, that this is a show that's woke trash. I don't think fully understand the history, nor have they taken time to even go and look up exactly what these organizations are. The 7th Calvary, while it's based on the original 7th Calvary from the 1800s, it's clearly a very twisted representation of it. The reason why it might have donned the Rorschach mask and taken on Rorschach's viewpoints is this follows the comic, which has the same ending as the movie, outside of the squid. Obviously, in the movie there was no squid, but in this story, the squid was brought to this earth transdimensionally by Ozymandias. It killed millions of people. Rorschach ultimately was vaporized by Dr. Manhattan, and then Rorschach sent his journal to a far-right publication in order to publish it, to let people know exactly what happened, or at least to give them the best idea that they could of what happened. And here it's been 30 years since that event's taken place, and we don't quite know exactly where anything is. We don't know what's been brought up as a result of that, but it's pretty easy to see that this organization, the 7th Calvary, with not a C, but a K, because, you know, racists, that they would look at that publication, they would see what happened, and then they would, want to basically start fighting once again for America's manifest destiny, which was one of the things that the original 7th Cavalry did. So when you look at it from that perspective, it now starts to make a lot more sense. Rorschach, as much as he was to many people the hero of Watchmen, as much as he was the central character, the protagonist of that story, the dude was a far right individual. His journal entries are pretty clear of that when reading it in the context of the comic. He didn't quite care for homosexuals. He had very negative critical comments about his neighbor, thinking she was cheating on welfare. He had his thoughts, and those were his thoughts that would most likely be echoed in his journal, which, all things considered, looking at how violent of a sociopath Rorschach was, could probably also be looked at as a manifesto. And if that is the type of publication that ended up being put out there, if that is the type of writings and rhetoric that was echoed through the right-leaning publication that he sent his journal to, then of course over the span of 3 decades, that is the narrative that is going to then be used. And we all know that people will go back and they'll read Mein Kampf, and that will be kind of an entry point into them becoming racists. That's not speculation. That happens, right? Far right ideologues write manifestos, they write articles, and people can be radicalized as a result of this. And that's basically what the 7th Calvary is doing. And that's, in my opinion, why they decided to take the mantle or the moniker or the costume of Rorschach as their particular uniform. It's how they view themselves. This is what Rorschach would have done. And we don't know what their plan is yet. We don't know what their plan is at this point in time, but I would argue that looking at how Rorschach was in the original graphic novel and how violent he was in the movie, he clearly took matters into his own hand. He clearly thought that he was right to do what he did in regards to being a vigilante. And these guys could also be looking at that through a very sick, twisted, racist, ideological lens. I'm not going to go as far as to say alt-right. I know some people out there are probably going to try to paint it as such, but we don't know their politics just yet. But this is clearly the type of politics that Lindelof is going for here, and it's using a town where there has been this type of situation in the past. And I think that is extremely fascinating, mostly because it feels almost like an antithesis to HBO's Confederate, which was a show that was going to be show run, or at least executive produced, by D.B. Weiss and David Benioff, where it was what if the South had won. And it was about dealing with the Confederate states, so on and so forth. And there was a big pushback from that when that was originally announced a couple of years ago, and it has since kind of fallen to the back burner. And I would argue at this point is practically dead, considering Game of Thrones is over and those guys are now over at Netflix and Disney, respectively. So, I would say that this almost feels like it's an antithesis, to that. It's the anti that, giving us a much different perspective on the world and where things are in a Robert Redford led country. One thing I noticed here was that there was no internet. There were no cell phones. They had pagers, which would make sense because in the 1980s there were pagers, and that technology advanced, but perhaps the internet did not. It didn't appear like a lot of people were, there's no one on smartphones. There was not a lot of what we would know, I think, as technological comforts today. Probably the most interesting piece of technology that we saw that would be consumer driven would be the size of the TV in Don Johnson's home at the end of the episode, showing the America's Hero story, showing that commercial or that trailer for it. Now, we do know that they have technological advances in other areas, like Looking Glass's pod that is able to basically act as a lie detector. And we also know that they have a variation of Night Owl's Archimedes ship, which again is super cool. And I lost my shit at that. I thought that was great. But what I found to be really interesting, though, was when we first meet Angela Abar, aka Sister Night, and she is in her son's adopted son. By the way, black couple, 2 white adopted kids. Apparently, this does get explained down the road. It's that again is something that I saw called out. Oh, they as being woke garbage, which doesn't make a fair amount of sense to me. People can adopt kids. Kids need parents. Just saying. It's not the end of the world if a black couple adopts white kids. Anyway, she's talking about being a cop. She's talking about a bit about being in Vietnam and growing up there. And the teacher asks her, "Oh, was this before or after it was a state?" And she says, "Oh, it was a few years before it was a state," which is easily alluding back to the fact that we won the Vietnam War in this alternate history timeline. So that's part of the politics as well. It's one of the reasons why she learned how to cook. She learned how to make pastries. And if you go and you look back at history, when the French went to Vietnam, before we went to Vietnam, they taught a lot of the locals how to make pastries, which is one of the reasons why after the events of Vietnam, a lot of Vietnamese nationals came here to the United States. And it's one of the reasons why donut shops and a lot of those, delicatessens, so on and so forth, are run by Vietnamese families, because that is what they were taught. And that is something that they have very much turned into a lucrative business here in the United States. And I thought that was really interesting that she lived there and that's what she learned to do. I mean, I know it's her cover, but I thought that was, again, a little bit of a fascinating aspect of the integration of basically usurping Vietnam and making it one of our own. I'd like to see the politics of that more defined. But then, of course, there was the line in there about Redfordations, right? Which is the name given for reparations from President Robert Redford. This was previously talked about in regards from an interview with Damon Lindelof, who had said that, yes, in this particular world, Robert Redford, who ran for president after Nixon, won Nixon, then has been president ever since. We're talking a long time. He has, provided reparations. He's paid that out, and he wanted to make a more socially just world. Reparations are a part of this particular democratic process or this democratic election, at least coming from the DNC side. It's been a topic of conversation before. It's kind of since recently died, but it will probably pop up again. And that's interesting that they added that in, where it feels like certain things have changed pretty greatly, other things not so much. And we don't quite know yet all the politics of the world. But what we do know, especially when it comes to the concept of turning the police on its ear, and again, police brutality is a big part of our society. The discussion surrounding that, everything involving Ferguson and a lot of other situations that have happened over the span of the last 5 years or so, has ultimately popped up in the show, where now cops are basically allowed to remain anonymous. In fact, it's illegal for them to tell anyone that they're cops. People cannot know that they are the police because it does protect them. But the flip side to that, the caveat to that, is that they have to request permission to use their firearms. They don't get to carry that. It's locked behind a buzzer and they have to call it in. So it does really kind of change the dynamic in a way that is very fascinating. And I'd like to see how that came to be a lot more fully defined. But it does give us this kind of flip the script on race relations, which again is, I think, a big part of this. People have argued that this is not Watchmen. This is in no way Watchmen. Lindelof doesn't get what Alan Moore was attempting to do. And maybe that's the case, because Alan Moore's name was nowhere on this show whatsoever. Not even co-created by Alan Moore and David Gibbons. It just says co-created by David Gibbons. It's nothing to do with Alan Moore. He wants nothing to do with it. However, I think if you go and you look at when the original Watchmen was written and what it did in regards to kind of shining a light on elements of our society, especially involving the Cold War, it was a heavily political book for the time. There's a reason why Nixon was still president. Kissinger was still involved. There's a reason why a lot of these things happened. And the way that they were written in the book is that they were very reflective of the time, just through Alan Moore's lens. And then he was very cynical about a lot of that stuff, and he was talking about it. Here we can see that Lindelof is taking the same approach, because our politics from the 1980s to the politics now near the beginnings of the of 2020 is clearly different, is vastly different. And they do talk about different issues. And I think that is where the show is coming from. It is going to be shining a light and holding up a mirror to a couple of things, flipping the script on other things. And what I hope is that over the course of the 9 episodes, which was entirely designed to be one complete cohesive story, that we do get to see elements of this explained. And I did talk to a friend of mine who has seen the first 6 episodes, and he does say that a lot more of it does get extrapolated upon as we go on. And that being said, I actually found it to be quite interesting. I want to see where they take it. Is this woke, racist, SJW PC nonsense? And no, it's not. And the people out there that are saying that it is probably didn't even really watch it, or didn't even take any kind of opportunity to look at it objectively, to compare and contrast it to the original work. And they don't want to actually think critically about the media presented to them. And I think that is doing themselves a disservice. I think if you stop for a second, pull back your own whatever, I don't want to say bigoted mask, but it kind of feels like that based upon some of the comments I've gotten on my review, then it's something that you should really take the moment to look at. If this show triggers you and you're upset in watching it, perhaps ask yourself why, and really look at the root of why that is. It's not necessarily the poor storytelling that you're trying to argue that it is, but it's the themes that it presents. So I would recommend really looking into that. The show, well, not perfect, is interesting enough to warrant watching, to see where exactly Lindelof is going to take it. There's a lot there that is reflective of our times, and I want to see his spin on it and what exactly he wants to take it. Now, granted, this is a left-leaning show. I will not deny that at all, but most things coming out of Hollywood are. So maybe pay attention, see what he says. wait till it's over before officially 100% condemning it. Anyway, again, the comments on this should be quite fascinating, should be quite interesting. I'm very curious to know your guys' thoughts, your guys' opinions on this. Let me know down in the comments below. They're going to be a fun one to read, and I look forward to your opinion, truly. I really do. So I'll talk to you guys later. Have yourself a fantastic day. Thank you for watching, and peace out.